On a freezing night in 1874, when the wind screamed through the Rocky Mountains like 1,000 angry ghosts, and snow fell so thick it erased the world, an old woman stumbled through the darkness with her 2 daughters clinging to her torn skirts. Her name was Elizabeth Morgan, and every step she took through the knee-deep snow felt like it might be her last. Behind her, her daughters Mary and little Ruth moved like shadows, their thin bodies shaking so hard from the cold that their teeth chattered loud enough to hear over the howling wind. They had been walking for 2 days with almost no food and no shelter, searching for a cabin they had heard rumors about, a place where a mysterious man lived alone in the wilderness. Elizabeth knew this was their final hope. If they could not find shelter soon, all 3 of them would freeze to death on this mountain, and no one would find their bodies until spring came and melted the snow that would become their grave. Through the swirling white darkness, Elizabeth finally saw a dim light glowing like a tiny star in the distance. It was a window, and where there was a window there was a cabin, and where there was a cabin there might be mercy. She pushed forward with strength she did not know she still had, dragging her daughters toward that light as if it were heaven itself calling them home. When they finally reached the rough wooden door, Elizabeth raised her frozen hand and knocked, each hit against the wood feeling like her heart pounding against her ribs. She did not know who would answer or what kind of man lived in this lonely place so far from any town. She only knew that this was their last chance, and whatever happened next would decide if her daughters lived or died. What happened when that door opened would become a story told for generations. A tale that proved one person's choice could change not just a few lives but an entire community, and show the true meaning of humanity in the wild and dangerous West. Elizabeth Morgan had not always been a desperate woman begging at a stranger's door. She had been born in Philadelphia to a good family, educated in proper schools, and married to a banker named Charles Morgan, who gave her a comfortable life in a fine house with servants and social gatherings. She had 2 daughters who wore beautiful dresses and never went to bed hungry, and for many years Elizabeth thought her life was settled and secure, that nothing could shake the foundation of comfort and safety she enjoyed. But the world has a way of destroying certainty, and for Elizabeth that destruction came in the form of a financial panic that swept through the eastern cities in 1873, wiping out banks and fortunes and futures in a matter of weeks. Charles Morgan lost everything in the panic. The bank he worked for collapsed, taking with it not just his job but all the money they had saved and invested. Within months they lost their house, their servants, their position in society, and finally Charles lost his will to keep fighting. He took his own life one gray morning, leaving Elizabeth alone with 2 daughters and debts she could never pay. The fine friends who had filled their parlor disappeared like smoke, and Elizabeth found herself working as a laundry woman, scrubbing other people's clothes until her hands bled, trying to earn enough to keep her daughters fed. But it was never enough. The city was full of desperate people, all competing for the same few jobs, and Elizabeth watched her daughters grow thinner and paler as winter approached. She heard stories about the West, about how land was free if you were brave enough to claim it, about how a person could start fresh and build a new life far from the failures of the past. Some of the stories were true and some were lies, but Elizabeth was desperate enough to believe the hopeful parts. She sold everything she had left, including her wedding ring and the silver brush that had been her grandmother's, and bought 3 tickets on a wagon train heading to Colorado Territory. Mary was 12 years old and Ruth was only 8, both too young to understand how dangerous this journey would be. How many people died trying to cross the plains and mountains to reach the promised land of the West. Elizabeth did not tell them about the dangers. She just held their hands and promised them that everything would be better once they reached their destination. The wagon train left St. Louis in early spring, a long line of canvas-covered wagons pulled by oxen and horses, filled with families who all believed they were heading toward something better. Elizabeth and her daughters traveled in a wagon with 3 other families, crowded together with all their possessions, which in Elizabeth's case was almost nothing. The other families had tools and furniture and supplies, while Elizabeth had only a small trunk with a few clothes and the last bit of money she had managed to save. The other women looked at her with pity and some with judgment, wondering what kind of mother would bring her daughters west with so little preparation. Elizabeth felt their stares but kept her head high, determined to prove she could survive whatever came. The journey across the plains was harder than anything Elizabeth had imagined. The sun beat down without mercy during the day, turning the inside of the wagon into an oven that left them gasping for air. At night the temperature dropped until they shivered under thin blankets that did not keep out the cold. Dust filled their mouths and noses and eyes, making every breath feel like swallowing dirt. The food was terrible, just beans and hardtack, and occasionally some tough meat from animals the hunters shot. Mary tried to be brave and help her mother with the cooking and washing, but Ruth cried often, asking when they could go home, not understanding that home no longer existed for them. They crossed rivers that ran fast and deep, and Elizabeth held her breath every time their wagon rolled into the water, terrified it would tip over and drown them all. They saw graves along the trail, markers for people who had died from disease or accidents or Indian attacks, reminders that this journey could be deadly. One woman in their wagon gave birth during a dust storm, and the baby died 2 days later. They buried the tiny body beside the trail and kept moving because the wagon train could not stop for individual grief, not when they had to reach their destination before winter made the mountain passes impossible. Elizabeth held her daughters close that night and thanked God they were still alive, still moving forward toward whatever future awaited them. When they finally reached Colorado territory after 3 months of traveling, Elizabeth felt a mixture of relief and crushing disappointment. The settlement they arrived at was called Silver Ridge, named for the silver mines in the surrounding mountains that had drawn prospectors and dreamers from all over. But the town was nothing like the advertisements had promised. It was just a collection of rough buildings thrown together with raw lumber, a muddy street lined with saloons and gambling houses, and everywhere the sound of men drinking and fighting and searching for fortune in the ground beneath their feet. There were very few women and almost no families, just desperate men hoping to strike it rich before the silver ran out or they died trying. Elizabeth used the last of her money to rent a tiny shack at the edge of town, a building so poorly constructed that wind whistled through the gaps in the walls and rain dripped through the roof. She tried to find work, walking from business to business asking if anyone needed a seamstress or a cook or a cleaning woman. Some men offered her work that was not really work but something shameful that she would never do, and she walked away from those offers with her face burning and her daughter's hands tight in her own. A few women in town hired her to do washing and mending, but the pay was almost nothing, barely enough to buy flour and beans to keep them from starving. As summer faded into fall, Elizabeth's situation grew more desperate. The work dried up as the weather turned cold and people stopped spending money on anything but necessities. The rent on their shack came due, and Elizabeth could not pay it, and the landlord gave her 1 week to come up with the money, or he would throw them out. She searched frantically for any kind of work, any way to earn enough to keep a roof over their heads, but there was nothing. The night before they were supposed to leave the shack, Elizabeth lay awake listening to her daughters sleep and wondering what she was going to do. She had heard rumors of a man who lived high up in the mountains, a hermit who had built a cabin in a remote valley and wanted nothing to do with people. Some said he was dangerous, others said he was just crazy, but a few people claimed he had helped travelers who got lost in the mountains. It was a desperate plan, but Elizabeth had no other options left. Elizabeth told her daughters they were going on an adventure, not wanting to frighten them with the truth that they were climbing a mountain in search of a stranger who might not even exist. They left Silver Ridge before dawn, carrying only what they could fit in 2 small bags, which was almost nothing. Mary carried 1 bag and Elizabeth carried the other while holding Ruth's hand, and they walked out of town, following the rough trail that led up into the mountains. Other people had told Elizabeth the general direction, where the hermit's cabin was supposed to be. But no one had exact directions, and she was navigating more by hope than knowledge. The trail grew steeper and harder as they climbed higher into the mountains. Elizabeth's legs burned with exhaustion, and her lungs struggled to pull in enough air in the thin mountain atmosphere. Mary never complained, just kept putting one foot in front of the other, but Ruth struggled and had to be carried part of the way. They stopped to rest when they found a stream, drinking the cold, clear water and eating the last bits of bread Elizabeth had brought. As afternoon turned to evening and the temperature began to drop, Elizabeth started to panic, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake, if she had doomed her daughters by bringing them up this mountain with no guarantee of finding shelter. The snow started falling just before dark, light at first but quickly growing heavier, until it was a white wall that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Elizabeth knew they had to find shelter soon, or they would freeze to death out in the open. She pushed forward through the deepening snow, half carrying Ruth and calling encouragement to Mary, who stumbled along behind them. Just when Elizabeth thought they could not go any farther, when her body was about to give out completely, she saw a shape through the snow that looked like a building. It was a cabin, solid and real, with smoke rising from a chimney that meant someone was inside. Elizabeth felt tears freeze on her cheeks as she staggered toward that cabin, pulling her daughters with her, knowing this was their last chance at survival. The man who opened the door was named Thomas Blackwood, and he looked exactly like the kind of person mothers warn their children about. He was huge, standing well over 6 feet tall with shoulders as broad as an ox, and his face was mostly hidden behind a thick black beard that had not been trimmed in years. His eyes were dark and hard, the eyes of someone who had seen too much pain and decided to stop caring about anything. He had lived alone on this mountain for almost 10 years, ever since the day his wife and baby daughter died from fever, leaving him with grief so heavy he could not bear to be around other people. He had built this cabin with his own hands, made it strong enough to withstand the worst storms, and stocked it with enough supplies to last through winters that could bury the world in white silence for months at a time. Thomas had no intention of ever letting anyone into his life again. He made that clear on his rare trips down to Silver Ridge to trade furs for supplies, speaking to no one more than necessary, and ignoring any attempts at friendly conversation. People learned to leave him alone, and that was exactly how he wanted it. But when he opened his door that snowy night and saw the old woman and her 2 daughters standing there, all 3 of them shaking with cold and close to collapse, something happened inside him that he could not control. He saw in their faces the same desperation and fear he had felt when he lost his own family, the same look of people who had reached the absolute end of their strength. He could not turn them away. He did not want to help them, did not want the complication of other people in his carefully controlled solitude, but he could not close the door and let them die in the snow. Thomas stepped back without saying a word and gestured for them to come inside. The cabin was warm from a fire burning in the stone fireplace, and the heat hit them like a physical thing after the brutal cold outside. Ruth started crying with relief, and Mary wrapped her arms around her sister while Elizabeth stood frozen in the doorway, hardly able to believe this frightening man was actually letting them in. Thomas pointed to some chairs near the fire and then turned to his small kitchen area where he began pulling out food and heating water for tea. He still had not spoken a single word, and the silence in the cabin was heavy and awkward, but Elizabeth was too grateful and too exhausted to care. She got her daughters settled by the fire and removed their wet outer clothes, rubbing their cold hands and feet to bring feeling back into them. Thomas made them a simple meal of venison stew with potatoes and carrots from his root cellar, and to Elizabeth and her daughters it tasted better than any fancy dinner they had eaten in their old life. They ate quietly while Thomas watched from across the room, and when they were finished, he showed them where they could sleep. He gave them his own bed, the only real bed in the cabin, while he took blankets and made himself a place near the fire. Elizabeth tried to thank him, words tumbling out about how grateful she was and how they would not be any trouble, but Thomas just shook his head and told her to rest. His voice was rough from years of not using it much, and his words were few, but there was something in his eyes that was not cruel or angry, just tired and sad. Elizabeth lay in the bed with her daughters curled up on either side of her, and for the first time in months she felt safe enough to truly relax. The cabin was solid and warm, the bed was comfortable, and her daughters were breathing steadily in sleep, their bodies finally warm and fed. She listened to the sound of the fire crackling and the wind howling outside, knowing that without Thomas's mercy, they would all be dead in that storm. She wondered what kind of pain had driven this man to live alone on a mountain, what tragedy had made him turn away from the world. She could see it in everything about him, the way he moved through the cabin like a ghost, the way he avoided looking at them directly, the way he seemed uncomfortable with their very presence. This was a man who had suffered greatly, and Elizabeth understood that because she had suffered too. In the morning, Elizabeth woke to find Thomas already up and working, adding wood to the fire and preparing breakfast. She got up and offered to help, saying she could not just lie around while he did all the work. Thomas looked like he was going to refuse, but then he shrugged and pointed to where his cooking supplies were kept. They worked together in silence, Elizabeth making biscuits while Thomas cooked eggs and bacon. Mary and Ruth woke up and came to the fire, both looking much better after a night of warmth and rest. Thomas gave them their breakfast and then announced he was going out to check his trap lines, making it clear he expected them to stay in the cabin where it was safe. Elizabeth nodded and watched him leave, this strange, silent man who had saved their lives and seemed to want nothing in return. The storm continued for 3 days, dumping snow until it was piled higher than the cabin windows and making it impossible for anyone to travel. Elizabeth did not talk about when they would leave because there was nowhere for them to go, and Thomas did not tell them to leave because the weather made it impossible anyway. They settled into a routine that felt almost natural after a while. Thomas would go out each day to hunt and check traps and gather firewood, and Elizabeth would cook and clean and try to make herself useful. Mary helped with whatever tasks needed doing, and Ruth, who was still very young, spent her time drawing pictures in the dust on the floor or watching the snowflakes fall outside the window. Elizabeth discovered that Thomas's cabin was well organized, but had been neglected in small ways that showed he did not care much about his own comfort. His clothes were patched but not well, and many had tears that should have been mended. She asked if she could repair them, and Thomas hesitated before nodding his agreement. Elizabeth was an excellent seamstress, one of the skills she had learned as a young woman, and she worked on his clothes with careful precision, fixing tears and replacing buttons and making everything neat and strong again. Thomas watched her work sometimes, and she could tell he was surprised by her skill. It made her feel useful and less like a burden, which was important to her pride. As the days passed, Thomas began to talk more, though he was never what anyone would call talkative. He told them about the mountain, about where to find different plants and how to read the weather in the sky. He showed Mary how to safely handle his rifle and taught her the basics of shooting, saying every person on the frontier needed to know how to protect themselves. Mary was a good student, paying close attention and practicing until she could hit a target more often than not. Elizabeth watched her daughter learning these skills and felt both proud and sad, knowing that Mary was having to grow up too fast, learning things no young girl should need to know, but that were necessary for survival in this harsh land. One evening about 2 weeks after they had arrived, Thomas came back from hunting and found Elizabeth crying quietly by the fire while her daughters slept. She tried to hide her tears when she heard him come in, but it was too late. Thomas stood awkwardly for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with her emotion, and then he asked gruffly what was wrong. Elizabeth told him everything, the words pouring out like water from a broken dam. She told him about her husband's death, about losing everything, about the terrible journey west and how she had failed to provide for her daughters. She said she knew they could not stay forever, that they were imposing on his kindness, but she had no idea where to go or what to do. She was out of money and out of options, and she was so tired of being afraid and desperate. Thomas listened to her story without interrupting, and when she finally fell silent, he sat down across from her and stared into the fire for a long time. Then he began to talk, and he told her his own story in more detail than he had told anyone since it happened. He spoke about his wife Anna and their baby girl Rebecca, about how happy they had been in their little cabin down in the valley. He described coming home from a hunting trip to find them both burning with fever, about how he had ridden for help, but by the time he got back with a doctor, it was too late. He talked about the guilt that ate at him, the feeling that he should have been there, should have done something different, should have somehow saved them. He explained that he came to the mountain to get away from all the reminders of what he had lost, but that the pain followed him anyway, and the loneliness was just another kind of suffering. Elizabeth listened and understood that Thomas was just as broken as she was, just dealing with his brokenness in a different way. She told him that neither of them could change the past, that they had both lost people they loved and made mistakes, but that maybe they did not have to keep punishing themselves forever. She said her daughters needed a home, and she needed help providing one, and he clearly needed someone to care about and care for him in return. She was not sure what she was suggesting exactly, just that maybe they could help each other instead of both struggling alone. Thomas did not answer right away, just kept staring at the fire, and Elizabeth worried she had said too much, that she had overstepped and made him angry. But then he nodded slowly and said they could stay, that winter was too dangerous to send them away, and they could figure out the rest when spring came. Winter deepened, and the cabin became a home in ways it had never been when Thomas lived there alone. Elizabeth brought a woman's touch to the space, arranging things more efficiently, and making small improvements that added comfort without changing anything essential. She found ways to stretch their food supplies, cooking meals that were simple but satisfying and wasting nothing. Mary continued learning from Thomas, absorbing everything he taught her about wilderness survival with an eagerness that impressed him. Ruth started to laugh again, the sound bringing life to the cabin in a way that surprised Thomas, reminding him that joy could exist even in difficult circumstances. Thomas found himself looking forward to coming back to the cabin each evening, knowing there would be warm food and conversation waiting for him, instead of just empty silence. He taught Mary how to tan hides properly, and she turned out to have a talent for it, producing leather that was soft and usable. Elizabeth used that leather to make new moccasins for all of them, replacing their worn-out Eastern shoes with footwear better suited to mountain life. They worked together like pieces of a puzzle that fit in unexpected ways, each person contributing what they could and benefiting from what the others provided. As the weeks passed, something shifted in the way Thomas looked at Elizabeth and she looked back at him. It was not dramatic or sudden, just a gradual recognition that they had become important to each other, that the arrangement they had made out of desperation was turning into something that felt like family. Thomas started smiling occasionally, and Elizabeth noticed how it changed his whole face, making him look younger and less frightening. Her daughters noticed too, and Ruth started calling him Mr. Thomas in a way that sounded almost affectionate. They were building something new from the broken pieces of their old lives, and while none of them would have chosen this path, they were discovering that good things could grow in unexpected places. When spring finally came and the snow began to melt, revealing the brown earth and the first green shoots of new growth, they all knew a decision had to be made. Elizabeth and her daughters could not stay indefinitely without some kind of formal arrangement, and Thomas had to decide if he really wanted to give up his solitude permanently. They talked about it one evening after the girls had gone to bed, both of them awkward and uncertain about how to proceed. Thomas said he had gotten used to having them there, that the cabin felt too empty when he imagined them gone. Elizabeth admitted she did not want to leave, that she felt safer and more content on this mountain than she had in years. What they were dancing around was the question of marriage, but neither wanted to say it directly. Finally, Thomas asked bluntly if Elizabeth would consider marrying him, not for romance necessarily, but for practical reasons that would make their arrangement proper and give her daughters a legal father. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, thinking about what this would mean. She had loved her first husband deeply, and this was nothing like that courtship and marriage. But she had also learned that love came in different forms, and that partnership and respect and shared purpose were foundations that could build into something strong. She said yes, she would marry him, and they would make this family official in the eyes of the law and the community. They made the long trip down to Silver Ridge to see the circuit preacher who passed through once a month. The townspeople were shocked to see the hermit Thomas Blackwood with a woman and her daughters, even more shocked when they announced their intention to marry. The wedding was simple, held in the small church with just a few witnesses, but it was real and binding. When Thomas put a simple gold ring on Elizabeth's finger, a ring he had made himself from gold he had panned from mountain streams, she felt tears in her eyes. They were starting a new life together, this unlikely family made from loneliness and desperation, and the courage to try again after loss. Thomas and Elizabeth Blackwood became a family that people talked about throughout the territory. Their story spread by word of mouth, carried by travelers and trappers and traders who heard about the hermit who had taken in a desperate widow and her daughters and ended up finding redemption. Other people facing hardships would sometimes make the climb to the Blackwood cabin, hoping for help or advice, or just a kind word from people who understood what it meant to start over. Thomas and Elizabeth never turned anyone away if they had food to share and space to shelter them, remembering what it felt like to be desperate and in need of mercy. Mary grew into a strong and capable young woman who could track and hunt as well as any man, and who helped her stepfather teach others the skills of mountain survival. She eventually married a trapper named Daniel Carson, and they built their own cabin not far from Thomas and Elizabeth, creating a small community in the mountains where before there had been only isolation. Ruth developed a talent for healing, learning from an old Native American woman who lived nearby about which plants could cure illness and how to set broken bones and treat wounds. She became the closest thing to a doctor that part of the mountains had, and people would travel for days to seek her help. Thomas lived to be 73 years old, spending his final years surrounded by family and friends, his cabin always full of life and laughter. The lonely hermit who had wanted nothing to do with people died peacefully with his wife holding his hand and his daughters weeping beside him. Elizabeth lived another 12 years after Thomas passed, continuing to welcome travelers and share the story of how one act of mercy had changed everything. She told everyone who would listen that the greatest gift we can give each other is compassion in moments of desperation, that opening our doors and our hearts to those in need is how we build community and find meaning in our own lives. The Blackwood cabin stood for more than 100 years, eventually becoming a historical landmark that people visited to learn about frontier life and the remarkable true story of the family who lived there. Historians documented Thomas and Elizabeth's story as an example of how the West was settled not just by individuals seeking fortune, but by people finding each other and creating communities in the wilderness. Their descendants spread throughout Colorado and beyond, carrying with them the values of compassion and resilience that Thomas and Elizabeth had embodied. The story became a legend told around campfires and in schoolrooms, a reminder that heroism is not always about grand gestures or dramatic battles. Sometimes the most heroic thing a person can do is open their door to a stranger in need, to take a risk on compassion when it would be easier and safer to turn away. Thomas Blackwood's choice to let Elizabeth Morgan and her daughters into his cabin on that snowy night did not just save 3 lives. It created ripples that spread outward through time, inspiring others to choose kindness over fear, connection over isolation. The lessons from their story remained relevant long after the frontier era ended, speaking to fundamental truths about human nature and the importance of community. In times when people are tempted to close themselves off, to protect only their own interests and ignore the suffering of others. The story of Thomas and Elizabeth stands as a powerful counterargument. It shows that we are stronger together than apart, that helping others often helps ourselves in unexpected ways, and that the connections we make with each other are what give life meaning and purpose. In the bitter cold of 1874, when an old woman named Elizabeth Morgan knocked on the door of a cabin high in the Colorado mountains, she was not just seeking shelter from a storm. She was seeking hope, seeking proof that humanity still existed in a world that had been cruel and unforgiving to her and her daughters. The man who answered that door, Thomas Blackwood, had every reason to refuse her request. He had built his life around isolation, around protecting himself from the pain that comes from caring about others. But in that moment, faced with 3 desperate human beings who would die without his help, he made a choice that changed everything. Thomas could not have known that letting Elizabeth and her daughters into his cabin would transform his life, pulling him out of his self-imposed exile and giving him a second chance at family and happiness. Elizabeth could not have known that her desperate climb up a mountain would lead not just to survival, but to a new life richer and more fulfilling than anything she had lost. Mary and Ruth could not have known that the frightening bearded man who opened the door would become the father they needed, teaching them strength and resilience and the skills to thrive in a harsh land. None of them knew how their story would inspire others or become a legend that lasted for generations. They were just people trying to survive, making the best choices they could in difficult circumstances. The story of the old woman who begged shelter with her 2 daughters, and the mountain man who changed everything by saying yes, is ultimately a story about the power of human compassion to transform lives. It reminds us that we are all interconnected, that the choices we make ripple outward in ways we cannot predict or control, and that acts of kindness create echoes that last far longer than acts of cruelty. Thomas and Elizabeth started as strangers brought together by desperation, but they became a family that showed an entire community what was possible when people chose connection over fear. Their legacy lives on not in monuments or wealth, but in the countless lives they touched and the example they set of what it means to be truly human. In opening his door to a desperate woman and her daughters, Thomas Blackwood opened himself to love and purpose again, and in doing so he proved that it is never too late to start over, never too late to choose compassion, and never too late to let others into our hearts. That one choice on a snowy mountain night changed everything, and its power echoes still through the generations, reminding us all that we have the ability to make a difference in the world simply by being kind to those who need us most.